We've got Joe Eichley, who is NDSU Extension Weed Specialist. But now we can watch your video, Joe, which is one of the best videos I've seen, and it's the only video we're going to show today. So let's show that video of Joe and get this afternoon going.
I'm about 5'8", which puts this plant at probably 7.5, maybe 8 feet tall. So we wanted to see how easy it's going to be for me to pull the taproot off of this plant out of the ground. So here's where I get to embarrass myself. Oh yeah. Ain't coming. I'm not saying I'm the strongest man in the world. Maybe Sam Markel could pick this out of the ground, but I can't.
All right, one more time. You got to do that shot. You got it. Come on, whoa! Ah,
You can get a picture of my blister later.
I love your sense of humor, Joe.
yeah, me too.
Well, if nothing else, you can learn from that video that my extension is just a stream of consciousness. And when our cameraman kept badgering me, I was like, well, there's another extension guy this guy knows.
That's funny. So we probably have quite a few questions for you, I would imagine. And I'm hoping that the audience will have quite a few questions too. We've got a captive audience with Joe here for half an hour. So thinking about timeliness, what do we need to know about post-harvest weed control in small grains?
Yeah, so we're mostly past the harvest campaign. There's obviously still some fields to go for small grains. Every year, especially this part of the state, we're always focused on water hemp. What do we do with water hemp after our small grains are off? Well, a reminder this year in a dry year is there is still a lot of kochia around this part of the state, and of course statewide there's of course plenty of kochia. And with the early harvest for small grains in some areas, that got us thinking, we have, depending on the weather, 30, 60, maybe more days until we get a hard freeze to kill off whatever was in that wheat field, because just because you harvest the wheat doesn't mean the weeds aren't going to come back. They will. And so we've been focusing on getting out there with either herbicide application to clean up those stumps of kochia that are regrowing. For water hemp especially, we know the month of August is a good month for water hemp to germinate if there's no crop canopy. And so we haven't caught much rain, but we have caught some rain lately. And I actually have a prop here I can show with the July 26th rain. We always talk about late emerging water hemp. Well, here's one that we can track to July 26th. So about a month old, seed head on it. And so that's why when we talk about, with water hemp in those small grain fields, there's still a wide window for plants to emerge, produce more seed before the year is over, and that's, of course, more seed going back in that field to fight for next year. So that's been our main focus after wheat harvest is cleaning up kochia and water hemp that was there at harvest, so those stumps that will regrow, and then water hemp that hasn't yet germinated, and how to control that moving into the fall just to minimize seed production for next year's crop.
How many seeds are on that plant, Joe?
Well, this one's a male, so none.
Okay.
But
if it were a female, I guess.
So we do know with water hemp, so there are male and female water hemp plants, and only the females produce seed. And this one is about a foot tall, a little less than a foot. And I was pulling plants last September. Of course, we had an early frost last September. And after that frost, I pulled a plant that was about 3 inches, and the seed head was smaller than the seed head on this plant. And I did thresh out 88 seed that I was able to count on a plant that was a third of this size. And that would have been a plant that emerged the second or third week of August. And so that's, when we talk about the seed production of plants like water hemp, we started with a video about Palmer amaranth. We always say, okay, this 1 million seed per plant is the capability. Or in direct competition with our crops, 100,000 seed per plant. Well, in a 3-week window, how about 100 seed per plant? So you're going from 1 seed to now 100 that would go back in the seed bank for future years. So just becomes a numbers game when it comes to weeds that produce a lot of seed like that.
Right. You and Jan do a lot of counting. I'm seeing between spider mites and weed seeds.
Jan and my crew do a lot of
Oh.
counting.
So true.
Yeah, we don't even mess with that. We have spores and diseases, so there's no point in even counting those. But I would encourage you to count eggs sometime, maybe, if you can do that with soil sampling.
All right, well, that's the next question on here. Concerns about herbicide carryover. How can tillage influence carryover?
Yeah, so the other question, we've been getting this question going back to last fall when we had a dry fall, and then of course this year has just been dry statewide. And so herbicide carryover. So we know that when we think about herbicide carryover, we're looking at a few things. Persistence of the herbicide, really the selectivity of that herbicide on whatever crop you will want to plant the next year. And so there's a couple that usually pop up towards the top of our list. And so some of them, some of our Group 2 herbicides can be long-lived, things like Pursuit and Raptor. And if you read herbicide labels like I do, so no one here, but if you actually read those things, you'll see a product like Pursuit or Raptor, it's going to be 3 to 4 years until something like sugar beet you're allowed to plant. But most of our crops have more tolerance. And so, most crops, whatever, we can plant the next year after 10 to 12 months. And that's usually fine in most years. There's other products like clopyralid, which is an active ingredient found in Stinger, found in Wide Match. We use a lot in sugar beets and a lot of that in small grains. And when you go to rotate towards something like sunflowers or peas or soybeans, the pea label is right now the most restrictive, or the rotating to peas, where you need 5.5 inches of rain from June through August, 7.5 inches total from time of application until planting peas the next year.
We did not get that.
Correct. In a lot of areas, we did not get that. And so that's why these questions are coming in, is we always want crop flexibility, and with some of our herbicides, we're going to need to take a close look at those labels this winter and figure out what crops we can actually rotate to, because yes, we're getting some rain now, but probably the next couple weeks is our last good chance to get some herbicide degradation from the microbes in the soil, because even if we have plenty of moisture, once we get colder, microbes slow down, degradation slows down. Once the ground freezes, all breakdown ceases. So we'll basically have this window until November, and then no herbicide breakdown will occur until we thaw again in the spring. And so that's just kind of the broad view of herbicide carryover, and most people are aware of the problematic ones that they've applied. But of course, this winter will be an important one to talk to your agronomist, to your extension agent, to try and figure out what you can rotate to. Now, as far as how can tillage affect carryover, usually the general statement we can say is if you till that ground, then you can actually dilute the herbicide within the soil profile and decrease your chance of crop injury.
I don't like hearing that, Joe. So what's our other option, or what do we need to think about then?
Well, and so the other things to think about is again, it really becomes a very product specific of what you applied in these fields, because I mentioned clopyralid earlier. So that's a product we know that carries over or is more persistent in coarse textured soil and low organic matter soil. So if you have pockets of those soil types in your field, those pockets are at higher risk. And so maybe here's another way that not tilling could influence it. If you build your organic matter up, then a product like that, you'd have less risk of a carryover. So,
there we go. That sounds a little better for the soil health specialist.
So as far as tillage, those are really the things to think about. So if you're, if you are okay with occasionally tilling and you're at that borderline, it's 10-month rotation interval to a crop, you've had no rain, tilling that soil will give you a better chance of avoiding crop injury next year. Otherwise, there's not a terrible amount of influence that tillage can have on the herbicide carryover. It's really more related to soil properties within the soil and that active ingredient.
Okay, so say you're a farmer and Abby Wick stops at your farm and they say, please don't till that this fall. I know you've got some herbicide residual, it's going to carry over. Say they come in and do in the spring some vertical tillage to kind of mix things up. How much degradation may they get? And I know this is a really tough question, but it's what's going through my head right now. What would you expect then if you did the spring vertical tillage and then planted into it as far as residual?
Spring vertical tillage probably won't do a whole lot for herbicide carryover. If you're only going 2 inches into the soil, so if you've had no rain, your soil hasn't blown all winter, so yes, you'll within that 2 inches be able to dilute the active ingredient. But in many cases, we have had rainfall, moved it into somewhere deeper into the soil profile. So disturbing that top 2 inches may not do a lot compared to 6 inches, and redistributing a concentrated zone of herbicide throughout the entire profile.
Okay, so change your crop.
Change your crop, or here's the beautiful thing about having me go after pathologists, go to the same crop.
Oh, oh no.
For carryover.
Oh
no.
For carryover, that's the safest bet.
But
Oh, man.
you carry over a lot more than herbicides when you do that.
But we do have plenty of options, most options, and most of those people in a corn-soybean rotation generally pretty well set up. It's once we start bringing in pulse crops, sugar beets, potatoes, where you really have to really narrow in and focus on those rotation intervals.
All right. So a reminder to everyone online, typing your questions into the box. If you're sitting here with us live, if you've written a question on one of those cards, just hold it up and Kyle Austin will grab it from you.
He's waiting. He wants to pick up those cards.
Eagerly waiting. So Joe, tell us about a bioassay. How do you conduct a bioassay?
Yeah, and so that's the other thing that we recommend, really give a lot of lip service to, but don't really give the details on how to conduct a bioassay. And so you probably heard the term before when we talk about, are you concerned about herbicide carryover? Usually those phone calls come in January, February, March. And how do you conduct a soil bioassay? Well, you need that soil. So you're not really going to go pull a whole lot of soil out of the ground when it's frozen. So the good news about having this event now and still having time this fall, still some warm soils, is if you do have a field you're worried about. So say you sprayed some wide match and wheat's off, the easiest way to just do a full bioassay is to go plant some check strips in that field of the crop you want to plant next year. So if you want to go to soybeans, go plant some check strips of soybeans. And ideally, you would want another field, similar soil type, that did not have that herbicide to compare it to. And then monitor the growth, look for injury. And essentially how we typically do bioassays over the winter are taking soil from a treated field and a non-treated field and doing this in the greenhouse or in your living room under some grow lights. But we do have some time to do kind of a larger scale experiment this fall where you can, whatever crop you want to plant there, plant some of those out in the field. And if you see injury, just knowing we're not going to have a whole lot of degradation between now and when you plant that crop, you can kind of assess your risk at this point in time.
Sounds like a really good thing to do right now.
It is. And then, another soil bioassay, or another way to think about soil bioassay. I heard cover crops mentioned earlier, something about the weed guide in cover crops. Well, we're always asked about seeding cover crops and risk based on the herbicide I apply. And some of that data that we generated, so we sprayed herbicide strips one way, planted cover crops the other way, that's essentially an experimental soil bioassay. And so if you've planted a mix of cover crops before, a general way you can phrase it or think about it, okay, you're going to plant canola next year. So we may not have in that weed guide great data presented in a clean format about herbicide risk to canola, but we do to turnips and radishes. And so similar plants, if it's a high risk of carryover and injuring your turnips or radish cover crop, probably a high risk of injuring canola if you were to plant that next year. And so that's, with cover crops, it's basically how we generate that data is giant soil bioassay experiments, more or less.
Well, while you're out planting your crop to make sure it's not going to be affected the next year, you could just plant some more cover crops and hope we get a little more rain. That would be nice. The equipment's out.
That's right. So let's shift to a couple of questions from the crowd. So besides 2,4-D or Roundup, what other herbicides could be used for a burn down before planting a multi-species cover crop for grazing?
Well, if you want a multi-species cover crop, and I'm assuming it's a blend with a number of different species, you really want something without any residual, especially if we have not tested or there's no data available from the rest of the U.S. And so even though there's hesitation from some, paraquat or gramoxone is one of the best non-spectrum kill what's out there herbicides we can use without any residual activity. Another one that we can use in a lot of cases will be glufosinate, which is Liberty. Typically wouldn't recommend that just because the price is kind of high, and if you actually look at those labels, many crops we can't plant for 120 days. Some of that's just related to they didn't do the testing for the label, so it's not on there. There could be some cases where there may be a little bit of injury, but at least we've seen once or twice in some research that possibility. So if you're going broad spectrum, 10, 20 species, gramoxone would be your best bet. Just kill what's there and then don't have any residual. Even the 2,4-D label, most of these cover crops aren't on the label, but they're on the anything else that you want to plant, which is a 30-day waiting period. So even though 2,4-D does not have much soil residual at all, we can still injure some of our sensitive broadleaf crops. So Roundup, Gramoxone are really the non-selective, absolutely no residual products that we have for that type of situation.
Okay.
Ooh, somebody took what you said to heart here. Do you suggest beans on beans with a rye cover crop for weed control? What do you suggest, Joe?
Well,
Sam's sweating. Joe's cautious.
Since I just submitted a video, Sam could probably beat me up. Absolutely beans on beans. No, so I'm assuming the question there may be also tied to soil residual herbicides you have, in which case beans would be safe, but rye should be safe to most of those herbicides because rye is one of our most tolerant crops. So that's part of what's ingrained in that question, then that would be okay. Rye for weed control, we've got some good data this year as well, and of course there's more data coming from everywhere else, and of course a whole bunch of testimonies, but I like to talk about data that we actually have, and rye is a good option for weed control, weed suppression. Does it replace your pre-emergence herbicide? No. Does it complement your pre-emergence herbicide? So if we burn down the rye and throw in whatever our pre-herbicide of choice is in soybeans, pretty good weed control, and will give us a longer window to get our post-emergence herbicide on. So it will take longer for any weeds in those fields to get up to that 3 to 4 inch window we're typically applying when we're looking at weed control, post-emergence weed control in soybeans. So certainly a fit. I have some data this year where if you burn down your rye with glyphosate and dicamba and another soil residual herbicide and doesn't rain for 8 weeks, your weed control is good. But assuming we want some more rain and we'll get some more flushes, that's why we keep that residual in there, is eventually even the rye biomass will also start breaking down. Weeds will break through, but certainly a good complement for a soil residual herbicide going ahead of soybeans. Dry beans as well. I know dry beans, there's a little bit more of an issue with moisture management and using up too much moisture, at least research out of Carrington the last 3, 4, 5 years, however long Greg Endress has done that research out there.
Can I ask that same question to you, though, Sam? Does that help having that rye in there between soybean on soybean at all? Do you know? And I haven't seen a whole lot out there, so that's why I'm putting you on the spot a little bit.
I think maybe the thing I would mention, just with limited time, and I know there's lots of reasons to grow bean on bean. I mean, herbicide carryover is just one of them. Economics, maybe another. Just it becomes very important to get out in the fall and figure out what your disease spectrum looks like, because by variety selection, getting a resistant variety to disease X, Y, or Z, you can really help yourself a lot that next year if you're going to go that route. I think maybe that's the most important thing I would say. And maybe we have, time for maybe one more question here. I think with the dry conditions, should we be concerned about atrazine carryover impacting next year's soybeans?
Yeah, so atrazine carryover, that's another product that, atrazine being one that's a higher risk of carryover. In general, how we had it built into the weed guide is if you use that 3/8 of a pound rate, we're typically not concerned about carryover, especially if the application was made before June 15. Any applications after June 15, we're getting into a more high-risk scenario. Higher pH soils, more risk of atrazine carryover, so I'm less concerned out west in the areas with lower pH soils. If you use half a pound or higher, then of course the risk is higher there as well. And so atrazine is one of these products that we do have some data in the weed guide. So when you pull soil cores this fall and get it tested for atrazine, we do have some general feeling on if you get a test result back of this many parts per million atrazine in the soil, we have some data on that one. There are a bunch of other products we have no data on. So I mentioned clopyralid earlier, and whatever data companies have, they don't want to share either. So I typically recommend don't test for herbicides in your soil test, because a lot of times we can't tell you what it means. No one can. Atrazine is one where we do have a little bit of information. So if you have a no detect on atrazine, you're probably good to go.
Okay, good information, Joe. Abby, do we have time for one more question, do you think?
I think Joe's pretty succinct in his answers.
All right. How soon is too soon to do a spring bioassay?
So, assuming they're testing the crop for next spring, I'd let the soil temps cool down a little bit more. So if you did catch some of this rain earlier this week, we still have soil temps. You're a soil scientist. What are soil temps at right now?
Well, it depends if you're on residue or not.
Ah.
It can be a little toasty when it's bare.
So if you got a slug of rain, an inch or plus of rainfall, and the soil temps are still, usually once we start getting down below 60, 55 is when everything starts slowing down and degradation really slows down. So if we're certainly still above 70 soil temps, have plenty of moisture, you're still going to have some degradation over the next week too. If you get some more rain, just kind of keeps feeding that system for breakdown. So may still be a little bit too soon to get a real accurate picture. But I think once we get to the middle part of September, if this weather pattern with cooler weather persists, then mid-September is probably a good time to start thinking about that process.
Okay, excellent. All right, time for your top picks. You have a top pick, upset pick? What do you got for picks?
Well, since I went ahead and walked a little bit and we showed me pulling a Palmer at the beginning, I have other pigweeds here. I did not bring Palmer with me.
Were these difficult to pull?
These are not. This guy, this one came right out of the ground.
Okay.
Yeah. This one's actually probably too easy for Sam. He would have tripped over it. So, got three pigweeds here just because I was able to find 3 different species within 10 feet of each other in a relatively nearby soybean field. This is red root pigweed. No, that's not going to be my pick. Now, these two are interesting. So, the last 2 years, we've had a lot of water. I've always said, well, now we know what puts the water in water hemp. Likes wet conditions. Well, I don't know if we want to start calling it drought hemp or what we want to call it now, but it's doing really well this year. And I'm going to say this is my pigweed pick of the year. About a month ago, I would have said Pal Amaranth would have been my pigweed pick for the year, because we have a lot of Pal Amaranth in the state. It gets confused a lot with water hemp and Palmer Amaranth because there are hairs on the stems of Pal Amaranth, but not that many, and they're sparse. And so I pulled this seed head just to show if you look for hairs on a Pal Amaranth, you look in the top part of the plant. So if you got a mature plant, you need to look in between these inflorescence for those hairs. If you find them, it's going to be Pal Amaranth. So until about a month ago, this was probably the pigweed doing the best in the state this year. Turns out it likes dry conditions. The last month or so is when water hemp has really been coming on strong. So there's been a lot of soybean fields that look pretty clean all year. But due to drought, we've had some off-target movement of dicamba in some cases, causing delayed canopy. For whatever reason, you may have had a delayed canopy closure, and we finally caught some rains in late July. There is water hemp poking up above a lot of soybean fields right now. And so, it's been a pretty low question year for water hemp, not certainly compared to the last couple years, but it's starting to rear its ugly head kind of right here as we're trying to close out the season. So pick of the year, or pick of the week, whatever, I'm going to go with pigweed pick of the week is water hemp.
Hopefully they're all male.
Unlikely.
Shoot.
All right, thanks, Joe. Well, we really appreciate your time with us today, Joe.
Absolutely.
And thank you for all the questions.